Welcome back. It's a Wednesday, the 26th day of July, 2017. I'm your host, Mark Hall. And let's start off doing something today that I haven't had a chance to do in a long time, and that's a whole bunch of good news all in a sequence. Yeah, sometimes we have good news and bad news, but given that things are a bit quieter than normal, and the FOMC isn't done with its meeting yet, so the economic collapse is still a little bit out in the future, some good news has risen to the top. As a matter of fact, I guess a bit of the good news, I saw one piece on Zero Hedge where a prominent advisor was saying, buy stocks, because you got 2 full months before the collapse. In any case, there's other good news as well, like this one. Obamacare repeal might not be quite as dead, at least in the Senate, as the Fourth Amendment is. The Senate has passed a critical motion to advance Obamacare repeal efforts by a vote of, basically, 50 plus 1 to 50. Vice President Mike Pence had to cast the deciding vote to move the debate on repeal of the evil Obamacare forward. Only 2 turncoats in the Senate, Susan Collins, alleged Republican from Maine, and Lisa Murkowski, same thing from Alaska, voted no. Senator Ron Paul, who seems to have been the prime mover in voting on just the repeal effort, has confirmed that he will vote in favor of, quote, whatever version of clean repeal could be passed with just 50 votes. But the brawl, of course, isn't over, as CNBC and a whole bunch of other mainstream sources are pointing out. The hard part is just getting started, and of course they remind us that Democrats and other critics of this latest effort to undo the evil claim that it would deprive millions of health coverage. Of course, on the other hand, there's a lot of us that would say Big Brother's socialist mandate truly deprives everyone of decent, desirable, free market health care, especially those who don't want to be slaves to the almighty state. So we'll watch and see, but this could mean pushing back the inevitable mark just a little bit. More good news. As Yahoo puts it, President Donald Trump tweeted earlier Wednesday that so-called transgendered people will no longer be allowed to serve in the U.S. military, quote, in any capacity. And they call that a stunning reversal of an Obama-era policy that affects thousands of service members. Far more importantly, folks, it affects the security of everyone who actually thinks the military's purpose is to defend these United States. Citing the need to focus on actual victory rather than political correctness, Trump said that the military cannot accept the burden of higher medical costs and, his term, disruption that transgendered troops engender. Quote, after consultation with my generals and military experts, please be advised that the United States government will not accept or allow transgender individuals to serve in any capacity in the U.S. military, Trump tweeted. Our military must be focused on decisive and overwhelming victory and cannot be burdened with the tremendous medical costs and disruption that transgender in the military would entail. Unquote. And you know what, folks? Bravo. It's about time. This missive, the WAPO noted, amidst their whining about this latest actual move towards sanity, comes after Trump's defense secretary, retired General Jim Mattis, delayed the implementation of the plan to coddle transgender troops by 6 months. The decision came just 1 day before the deadline for the military to upgrade its so-called medical standards, some would say downgrade, to accommodate transgender soldiers sick. The Pentagon, which seems to have too many Obama-era holdovers still, referred all questions about Trump's most recent announcement to the White House. Evidently, there's a battle they're not fit to fight. And the WAPO feels compelled to remind us about all the whining this latest move entails. Under Defense Secretary sick Ashton B. Carter, they noted, during the Obama regime, the military lifted the ban on transgender troops and decided it was a lot more important to coddle soldiers than train them. Thousands of troops serving in the military, claims the WAPO, are transgendered, and they cite a RAND Corporation study that says some estimates say there may be as many as 11,000 transgendered soldiers out there somewhere. They quote Brad Carson, former Congress critter who worked on so-called transgender policy under the Obama regime, who said in an interview earlier today that months of delays have left the door open to Trump doing what he just did. And he disputed the president's claim that the Joint Chiefs are in favor of returning to a policy where fitness is more important than political correctness. Carson claimed he talked to, quote, every single chief in the Joint Chiefs while he was working on transgender policy, and not one of them was in favor of a full ban. Evidently, they were buying the propaganda that Hitler was going to win, and they still wanted a job. The WAPO has paragraph after paragraph of whining by the so-called LGBT community, threatening lawsuits and saying things like, "Don't mess with us." And I can't help but pause here. Remember Rush Limbaugh's famous wisdom from years ago that the purpose of the military is to kill people and break things. I would add a caveat. Wouldn't it be nice if they did so in defense of the United States rather than the empire and in accord with the Constitution? Put differently, truly defensive warriors ought to be able to beat the hell out of what the Obama regime's been trying to turn the military into, a bunch of social justice warriors. And I do have one final observation here on this bit of the good news sequence. Lest people forget that transgenderism, or gender identity issues, are just one of the many conditions that are disqualifying for medical service. They were, and now they may be again. Did you know there are a whole bunch of psychological issues that are already considered disqualifying, from depression, bipolar disorder, psychoses, and other unspecified depressive issues, according to the military's own standards? Sites like Navy.Army.com and Military.com, as well as government sources. All kinds of drug use is disqualifying, even anabolic steroids. You'd think that might apply to unnatural hormone addictions too. Think about it. The same thing goes for other mental deficiencies or other conditions or perceptual defects that would interfere with school or employment. ADD and ADHD too are disqualifying, and we live in a society that seems to be encouraging that kind of development. Although, yeah, it seems like we're still being lied to about the causes. There are certainly far more of those around than there are transgenders. Same thing goes for dyslexia. Isn't it funny that a person who can't tell their right from their left is disqualified, but not someone who can't tell an innie from an outie? Finally, there are all kinds of other bodily deformities that are disqualifying, from elephantitis to clubfoot. And this one caught my eye. We'll end with this one because the irony is palpable. Did you know that the absence of just one kidney is disqualifying, but not the self-imposed absence of both cojones? Well, at least not under the Obama regime. Perhaps we could even look forward to the point where the kind of insanity that promoted the military's preoccupation with social justice and political correctness, as opposed to, say, battle readiness and unit cohesion, would itself be identified as a disqualifying behavioral disorder. Because this kind of mental deficiency is certainly a clear and present danger to the continued security of these once United States. Thankfully, maybe we're seeing a return to a bit of sanity here, and that indeed is good news. From there we go to still more good news. One of the world's biggest liars, but he's made a fortune doing it, Al Gore, has been humiliated by NASA. You may recall, although the waste stream is not about to remind you, neither is Al Gore. He's got a new movie coming out, Doubling Down, as a matter of fact. But Al Gore falsely and famously predicted that sea levels would rise by some 20 feet and actually would have flooded some of the world's largest coastal cities by now. Wrong. But yet another new study, this time from NASA, confirms the obvious. Not only was Al Gore wrong, but after tiny rises for a few years, sea levels are again falling, and not even rising at all. From IceAgeNow.info, quote, NASA satellite sea level observations for the past 24 years show that, on average, sea levels have been rising 3.4 millimeters per year. That's 0.134 inches, about the thickness of a dime and a nickel. But in 2016 they fell some, and it looks like we're headed for the second such year in a row. And imagine this, even without the Paris Climate Accords. I guess the really good news would be if Al Gore's latest self-serving set of whoppers would get completely laughed out of theaters. We've got more good news, too, but it's preliminary. For example, from Breitbart, House conservatives are going to launch an effort to conduct an official House Judiciary Committee-led investigation into former Attorney General Loretta Lynch mob and rightfully, justifiably fired former FBI Director, I love saying that, and Chief Whoremeister in charge of that whorehouse, James Comey, as they put it, a notorious leaker. And yes, of course, as usual, apologies to any honest prostitutes that are offended by being lumped into the same category with James Comey. Breitbart News says that they can exclusively confirm that Representatives Matt Gaetz of Florida, Andy Biggs of Arizona, and Mike Johnson of Louisiana, along with Jim Jordan of Ohio, have drafted an amendment that would compel government cooperation with a congressional probe into Lynch and Comey's activities. Specifically, the amendment, of which Breitbart has a draft, would compel the production of documents and evidence, unless, of course, they decide to bleach fit them immediately, if they even still exist, regarding Lynch's order to Comey to mislead the American people by stating that he should refer to the investigation, into the mishandling of classified data and the use of unauthorized and vulnerable email servers by former Secretary of State, you-know-who, Hillary, as a matter rather than an actual criminal investigation, and the amendment specifically presses the Department of Justice to cooperate with the congressional investigation all of this would create, making it easier for Attorney General Jeff Sessions, if he decides to take the mission, to probe these and other matters. But of course, that may not happen, because another story, this I would still call good news, comes from the latest presidential tweet storm concerning the Attorney General. Trump has again blasted Sessions, in spite of calls from both wings of the unified bird of prey to tone down the attacks. In the latest tweet storm, Trump blasted Sessions for not replacing Deputy Whoremeister and acting FBI Director now, Andrew McCabe, who was inexplicably allowed by Comey to oversee the Clinton email investigation, despite the fact that he too had conflict of interest up the yin-yang, like his wife receiving substantial funding from Hillary Clinton ally Terry McAuliffe during her Senate campaign. Said Comey in a tweet, "Why didn't AG Sessions replace acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe, a Comey friend who was in charge of Clinton investigation but got big dollars, 700,000 of them, for his wife's political run from Hillary and her representatives? Drain the swamp," unquote. And hopefully you see what I mean. While that might be good news, at least he's keeping up the pressure, it's not great news. Great news would be if Comey and McCabe and their BFFs like Robert Mueller were all fired. No, that doesn't drain the swamp, but it would get rid of a few of the biggest crocodiles. And on that score, USA Today says, infuriated by the ongoing Russia distractions, President Donald Trump stepped up his public criticism of Jeff Sessions yesterday, but declined to say whether or not he would fire the Attorney General, who was, they note, one of his earliest and staunchest supporters. Said the President, "I told you before, I'm very disappointed with the Attorney General, but we'll see what happens." Speaking at the Rose Garden, he said, "Time will tell, time will tell." Here's some more good news about one of the biggest bloviators on the web, Snopes.com, the self-appointed guardians of the gateway of truth. When they tell you something is false, you can pretty well rest assured it's a conspiracy theory that's being proven beyond any possible doubt. I saw this link this morning on Jim Sinclair's economic website, jsmindset.com. He tells us about a friend of his, Dr. Dave Janda, who wrote the following, with the introduction that Dr. Dave pulls no punches and is a beacon of light fighting for the truth. Says Sinclair, I've personally been snoped before by readers, which only strengthens my resolve each time they supposedly fact-check with their agenda. 9/11 is a perfect example. Unfortunately, it still looks like they might be around a while longer because their GoFundMe efforts have raised significant funds. Hopefully it won't be enough, but you kind of know the deep state would bail them out if necessary. Unless they blow it all imbibing in prostitutes and blow, unquote. Here's what Dr. Dave Janda wrote about these pieces of rancid stuff. I had to clean that up just a bit. Said Dr. Dave, when I exposed half of Obamacare was hidden in the stimulus bill in 2009, the lead POS, as he put it, from Snopes called him up and basically told him he had to retract what he'd said or your career will be immediately destroyed. Said Dr. Janda, my response, at least I have a career. All you have is a septic tank to hide in. And he went on to tell Snopes they could tell Obama in turn the truth will be blasted to every corner of this country by every ounce of my being, unquote. And he signed his letter for publication to Jim Sinclair, may these bastards rot in hell. So as you can see, folks, there are a lot of people that know Snopes to be what they are and don't much care for them. The article that all of this refers to is the following, via Zero Hedge, which says that Snopes.com is a liberal blog that dates back from the mid-90s. The website claims to be the Internet's oldest and most popular fact-checking site. As your host, I find they're useful for the occasional punchline, or to make the point about just how big the lie is. But last year, Snopes.com's co-founder was accused of embezzling money and spending it on, well, prostitutes and the usual. But now the company's been reduced to begging for money. They have a GoFundMe site up asking for $500,000 to keep on spreading the manure all over the web. May they fall far short and eventually be forced to turn off the deep state-approved light. But yeah, don't hold your breath. There is one last bit of good news and humor associated with this one. Courtesy of iBank Coin, they say that Facebook's own Ministry of Truth has hit a major snag which may force them out of business. There's a whole lot of detail here about how they'd contracted with an outside vendor to provide certain services. It was none other than San Diego-based Proper Media, which bought out the co-founder of Snopes, Barbara Mickelson's share, for $3.6 million after a nasty divorce. And when it's all said and done, Tyler Durden cogently summarizes their predicament this way. Who could have imagined that the biased, fact-checking website, they put that in great big quotes, run by militantly liberal, rabid anti-Trumpers and co-founded by a cheating, whoremongering, cat-abandoning, embezzling degenerate, would sign such a sloppy contract? Unquote. This next one is still good news, but it's mostly good news and bad news. The headline says, declassified memos now show that Obama's NSA spied on Americans even way more than you thought. Back in May, begins this summary, the FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, found that no such agency, NSA, but now admitted, even Snopes probably admits it, under former President Barry Sabarco, the man with more aliases than anybody else ever to infest the Oval Office, routinely violated what were laughably called American privacy protections while scouring through overseas intercepts and failed to disclose the full extent of the problems until the final days before Donald Trump's election last fall. Here's the quote. The October 26, 2016 notice that disclosed NSA Inspector General review indicated that, quote, with greater frequency than previously disclosed to the court, NSA analysts had used U.S. person identifiers to query the result of Internet upstream collection, even though NSA Section 702 minimization procedures prohibited such queries. This disclosure, it says, gave the bogus court, and I'm quoting, substantial concern, unquote. And what? You mean they lied again and did it even more than they've been lying about before? This story goes on to document pages of violations. Even the bogus FISA court admits that NSA analysts have been conducting illegal queries targeting American citizens with, quote, much greater frequency than they had been told, and they call that, I hope you're sitting down for this one too, a very serious Fourth Amendment issue. Yeah, like the existence of NSA and the court that's supposed to keep them under wraps. The litany of violation included, quote, numerous over-collection incidents where the NSA gathered information about foreigners or Americans it wasn't supposed to intercept. Ooh, surprise, surprise. Isolated instances in which NSA may not have complied with documentation requests to justify their illegal searches and seizures. The misuse of, quote, overly broad queries or specific U.S. person terms to search through data that if we had a Fourth Amendment would never have been collected to begin with, and of course the usual failures to timely purge, which is to say they never do, the NSA databases of improperly collected intelligence. And then they give some examples. Americans should be alarmed, said Patrick Toomey of the ACLU, that the NSA is vacuuming up their emails and phone calls without a warrant. The NSA, he continued, claims it has rules to protect our privacy, but it turns out that those rules are weak, full of loopholes, and violated over and over again, unquote. And come on, folks, that was written in stone about the time we moved away from words in the Bill of Rights like shall not, and made it, well, okay, if you feel like it. If there's any good news here, folks, and the fact that, yeah, they're lying about how badly they're lying, it's that at least eventually the degree of Big Brother's perfidy continues to trickle out. But that swamp hasn't even begun to be drained. More good news to the extent that more Clinton-era criminality continues to leak out. Who knows, maybe someday even the waste stream will be forced to admit this is real crime as opposed to the Rusky BS they've been trying to foist down American throats. The FBI has seized some smashed computer hard drives from the home of Florida Democratic Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the infamous head of the DNC who helped rig the primaries for Hillary, and of course commit a whole bunch of other crimes for which, like the rest of the crew there in the swamp, she has, up until now, pretty well gotten away with. We're talking about the two Pakistani-born Awan brothers, longtime right-hand IT aide to the former DNC chairwoman, and pretty close to the thick of the IT, email, and financial shenanigans scandals, who desperately tried to get the hard drives back, because, of course, there was nothing on them that needed to be smashed anyway. Hey, trust us. You trust Hillary, don't you? Now we learn that one of those same two cohorts, Imran Awan, has been charged with bank fraud after he tried to flee the country and was captured at Dulles Airport. And all of this, notes Jim Hoft at the Gateway Pundit, after the man's wife did successfully flee the country, making it to Pakistan with close to $300,000. Next, from Great Britain, some bad news that turns out to be at least kind of good news. The BBC tells us that a 5-year-old girl outside of London has been fined £150, that's several $100, for the crime of trying to run a lemonade stand, where she sold 50-pence cups of the forbidden lemonade to festival goers, something called the Love Box Music Festival. When she was approached by 4 nasty-looking enforcement officers who walked over from the other side of the road, she burst into tears, grabbed her father, and said, "Daddy, Daddy, I've done a bad thing." Said the father, "I was quite shocked. I thought they would just tell us to pack up and go home because they didn't have a license. But instead, they presented him with a list of violations, telling him you needed to have a street trading license to operate a market stall, for which the fee is £75. You have to be over 17 years of age to hold a license anyway, and so forth and so on." Well, said the father, we were then issued a fine of £150. We packed up and walked home. But the good news is that after a bit of adverse public exposure, the Tower Hamlets City Council has decided they'd better cancel the fine and even apologize. Said a council spokesperson, "We're very sorry that this has happened. We expect our enforcement officers to show common sense and use their powers sensibly. This clearly did not happen." They canceled the fine and said, "We've contacted Mr. Spicer and his daughter to apologize." Unquote. And when it comes to really good news on that front, folks, just imagine if this concept of common sense and using powers sensibly was to become epidemic. Why, the swamp might even decide to self-drain. However, don't expect sensibility from a public-private partnership that, if we had a constitution, also wouldn't exist, and if we had honest money, wouldn't exist either. I'm talking about the Federal Reserve, and their Open Market Committee, as you may know, is supposed to meet today, and may or may not, the betting is that they won't, decide to raise rates. While I was waiting for this particular shoe to drop, or at least the news to come out, I did see this story from Zero Hedge about how new home sales have disappointed as the median price of new homes dropped year over year, too. They call it disappointing existing home sales and a notable drop in home builder confidence, all of which led up to new home sales that modestly disappointed in June, falling a little bit under expectations of 615,000, along with a small downward revision. They like to do that in arrears from last month. Well, finally the news is out, and yes, it can be told. As expected, the FOMC didn't raise rates and maintained their Fed funds target at 1 to 1.25%, while providing forward guidance for gradual increases in rates, depending, of course, on data, which at least so far they've been able to ignore successfully anyway. Zero Hedge has a news story up by Stone McCarthy, who's now said that he's turned bearish on the U.S. economy and predicts no more rate hikes this year. And while they expect a change in reinvestment policy at the September meeting to begin in October, they're not looking for anything else this year. And furthermore, they say due to disappointing inflation numbers, they're lying about how much there really is anyway, we don't look for another rate hike at all in 2017, and only 2 next year. And furthermore, even the modest tightening via the balance sheet could be delayed if it looks like an increase to the debt limit is not immediately forthcoming, they said, and with it there are risks of a U.S. default on its sovereign debt, which, as your host and just about every other honest Austrian economist have noted for a long time, is absolutely inevitable. The only question is, how will they do it, and will they ever admit it? Meanwhile, just expect the usual hyperinflation and blame it on the new guy. Thanks for joining us, and may Yahuwah bless you and yours.